Tonight we're joined by a special guest, Alex Sotheran. Alex is an archaeologist, he's an historian, and he's also a wargamer with a hugely successful YouTube channel on that subject called Storm of Steel. I first met Alex in a working man's club in Mexborough in 2019, I think, when he gave a talk on his work in conflict archaeology, and I've followed his channel online since he started it during that COVID period when we all did kind of different things. So in this possibly unique chat, we're going to take our discussion from the battlefield to the tabletop. So welcome, Alex.
Very much, Paul. It's a pleasure to be here. It's an honour, in fact. It's not just a pleasure.
Well, the honour's all mine, old chap, because I've been looking for an excuse to kind of get a bit of wargaming into this this podcast, because it's it's one of those kind of levels I think of history, which I'm sure we'll kind of come on to. But kind of looking back to where I first came across you, even before I met you in that working man's club in Mexborough, I remember you in the series Finding the Fallen. So your background really is in archaeology, Alex, isn't it? I wonder if you can tell us how you ended up following that path.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm a professional archaeologist. I currently work for the Ministry of Defence, Defence Infrastructure Organisation, but no one's ever heard of that. So I just mentioned it's the Ministry of Defence because everyone knows who that is. So I'm an archaeologist that covers the north and Scotland and looks after the Rangers, basically where the military train. So I've been an archaeologist. This is my job at the moment, but I've been an archaeologist for over 20 years now. I think I started in field archaeology back in 2001. Prior to that, I was at university, did a degree at York. Prior to that, I just done 1 or 2 days here and there as an archaeologist, but I was always interested in it as a kid. I was always interested in history. I was always kind of felt that I was more... I liked practical things rather than reading, if that makes sense. And, there's nothing more practical than digging a ditch on a sunny afternoon, really. So archaeology kind of spoke to me from that point of view. And it's just that I think, the tangible part of archaeology is the fact that you're literally touching history. That when you find an artifact, the last person to have dropped it is the person who owned or made it, centuries ago. So I've always had that interest in archaeology, and I've worked as an archaeologist across the world, various countries. Not just in battlefield archaeology, which I'll talk about in a sec, but I'm trying to think of where I've worked: Iceland, Japan, Africa. That's lots of countries in Africa, isn't there? Tanzania, I'll be more specific. East Africa, Singapore. But that was kind of through archaeology rather than as an archaeologist. But lots of places. So I've seen a lot of the world, and I think archaeology is good for that, for letting you see parts of the world that a lot of people probably wouldn't be interested in. Just some field in the middle of nowhere. Oh yeah, Ireland for 4 years. How can I forget? But I've also, since 2002, and I think this is probably the reason we're going to talk really, is I've been involved in battlefield archaeology, First World War archaeology specifically, more so than anything else. I've done quite a lot of other military archaeology in my day-to-day job here at the MOD, but my real emphasis and interest is in battlefield archaeology. And I've got to say, Paul, you are slightly to blame for that.
Gosh.
Now, back in, when was it, about 2000? You were involved in with the diggers up at Boozemore, weren't you?
Yeah.
On that TV show. Now, I just started as a field archaeologist, and I think it must have been 2000, 2001, because I just moved to Ireland. And I was watching that programme and thinking, that right there is what I want to do. So you are, in a roundabout way, half to blame for me getting into battlefield archaeology.
Oh gosh! I mean, the joke is, I'm not an archaeologist. You're the archaeologist. I'm just the historian. And the nice thing, the privilege for me with the diggers is that they very kindly invited me onto what they were doing. I mean, as you know, they were not professionals. They were amateur archaeologists, and they invited me onto that dig to kind of to watch it really, and I got that opportunity to kind of see what that kind of archaeology could tell us about a subject like the First World War. And then when you went on to do that yourself, I mean, this was, the kind of work that you did in those early years. It's groundbreaking because conflict archaeology wasn't really a thing then, was it?
Not at all. No, no, no. There was very few people. There were the diggers out in Boesinger. I know some of the guys at the Flemish Institute were doing bits and pieces of archaeology, because we ended up working with some of those after I joined the group that I joined. But the way I got into it, I went to a battlefield archaeology conference hosted by Andy Robertshaw, and I think it must have been Martin Brown at the time, down at the National Army Museum. And one of the guys giving a talk at the time was Alistair, whose surname escapes me. I've known him for 20 years and his surname escapes me. He was doing a talk about Ancient-Villiers, which I'm sure you know, Ancient-Villiers. I think everybody who's been to the Somme knows Ancient-Villiers, don't they? And Havre.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and she has, in her back garden, as most people who have been will know, she's got that communication trench that runs through the back garden. And they were digging it just as a team of volunteers, and basically, Avril was putting them up and feeding them and watering them. And I talked to Alistair after that. Alistair Fraser, that's it, he's just come back to me. I talked to Alistair after his talk and just said, look, I'm new in archaeology. I'm looking to do some battlefield archaeology. Is there a place for a volunteer? Heard nothing back for a long time. And then suddenly, just out of the blue, Andy Robertshaw dropped me a message and just said, do you want to come out in April? So picked up my trowel, said, yeah, okay, I'll turn up there. And that's kind of when I fell in with that team. We then became known later. I think at the time they were called something like the Trench Team or something ridiculous like that. But we changed the name to No Man's Land. And it kind of came a bit more formalised in that way. And we did some more work around Serre and things in 2003. And we ended up doing quite a lot of sites. We ended up working on the trenches in Tietval Wood. That was about 2004. We ended up going there for about 10 years, 2 times a year, just for a week. And all of this was literally busman's holiday stuff for us, really, because we went places where we were getting fed and given our labour for free, kind of thing. We got bed and board at Tietval, for example. So we were staying down at Miramont on a big sheet. And a load of people from Northern Ireland came across from the Somme Association who owned the wood. And so we had some really good friends out of the back of that. We had a really, the team was really good. And then there was a bit of a split in the team from No Man's Land, and some of us went off to do some bits and pieces. And you mentioned it already, the Finding the Fallen stuff, which you can talk a little bit more about. That was paid work through a TV company. And if you want me to give you a bit of background on that, I can explain it a bit.
Because TV history is very different, isn't it, to kind of what you would be doing, I guess, when you were working in Chatval Wood and some of those kind of projects.
Yeah. The stuff in Tietval Wood, just to give you the background to that, is we got involved with the Somme Association. As I said, they'd bought the wood, I think, in 2004, and they wanted to open it up to the public, obviously show off some of the trenches. So we were asked, because we were known in that area, kind of asked to see if we'd be involved. But they also, as I say, brought along a load of volunteers as well from Northern Ireland who'd never done any archaeology. So within our team, within No Man's Land at the time it was, about half of us were archaeologists, professional archaeologists. The other half were guys who were various different backgrounds. So we had I'm trying to think, Steve was Met Police. We had quite a few other different people from different backgrounds who weren't archaeologists, but because we had half of us were professional archaeologists, we were, we kind of steered it from a professional point of view, so that everything that we did ended up as a report, and we put these reports out in the public. You can still find them today on the internet. So we tried to do everything that we did in our day jobs, even though we were doing it as a bit of a hobby. And as you say, at the time, back in the early 2000s, First World War archaeology in particular was just not a thing at all. It was really, it was pretty much the diggers who were doing stuff, and as I say, the Flanders Institute, and not many other people. We helped. I'd say we didn't do it ourselves, but I think we certainly helped professionalise First World War archaeology, and we tried our best to do everything that we would do as a standard in the UK on the sites that we were doing. So as I say, everything was recorded. All the finds were for weighed, and vast quantities of finds in many cases. Because the First World War is full of finds. But then doing the Finding the Fallen stuff, that kind of came off the back of these various other projects. But that because that was paid work, and that was it was steered a little bit because the company that were doing it were a Canadian company. So my mate Dave Kenyon was he was like the project manager for the archaeological works. He was kind of tasked with finding Canadian sites that we could then excavate, and they would then film, and then that got turned into eventually two series of about 5 or 6 episodes each, and I think some of them are kicking about on YouTube.
Yeah, there's a guy uploaded a lot because they're not available on any streaming service, but a guy has put a few, and I'm sure they'll remain for a short while before they disappear again, as with all those kind of things. But
yeah,
worth checking out.
Copyright strike against it. Yeah, you can find them there. But that meant that we ended up excavating quite a lot of different sites. It might have only been for like a few days, a week or so, but we did a lot of stuff. So just off the top of my head, we excavated up at Courcelette, we excavated at Vimy Ridge, just outside of the park. So it was in farmers' land just outside. We were close to where the guys from the Durand group were working on their underground tunnel stuff, like literally around the corner from them. We found some of the early mine workings and some of the evidence for the bombardments, the Stokes mortar bombardment before the attack of 1917. Where else did we do? The Bourlon Wood, as part of Combray, and the hunting lodge that was used as the battalion HQ. We excavated that, found bits and pieces of tank as well, and we photographed some of those famous photos in the woods, where you can see the hunting lodge in the background and the 2 tanks on the track. We found bits of those tanks and excavated that lodge. Trying to think of other ones because there were so many.
I remember there was one at Lewes where the dig got compromised, didn't it? And somebody came and disturbed the human remains, which I guess is the fear of any archaeologist doing that kind of work.
Yeah, absolutely. This one was. It was. We were up at Lewes. It was Auchilles Mines, Mines, just on the edge of the craters that are just up in the woods up there. I'm sure you know this area.
The Hohenzollern area, yeah.
That's right, yeah. I'm never able to pronounce that word. I try not to say it if I can avoid it, because I always make a mess of the German. But yeah, we'd found. This was the first time we went. So we went there twice actually. The first time we found bits and pieces of human remains. One of them, it was literally just the legs of a guy and his backpack. It was British. You pretty much tell these things pretty quickly because you can tell boots or, if they've got any accoutrements on them. This guy had a British small pack on it, but literally it was his pelvis and his legs. So what we did, we stayed up there till about 11 o'clock that night, excavating the body remains, because we always said, we don't go looking for bodies, we don't prospect for bodies, but if we find them, we treat them as we would any other archaeological site that we do in the UK, and we try to lift them in a day to get them out of the ground, because we know where they are. So, it doesn't always work out like that, but that was like our kind of what we wanted to do. And so this guy, we obviously there's no chance of ever IDing this fella, but we were able to lift the bones, and we, cleaned up. I think we'd finished by about 11 o'clock that night, 11:30. And a small village like that, everybody knows that something is going on. So we did have an audience throughout that night. There were the people watching us kind of from the side, so it's just the locals. But we packed up and went back home. Then the next morning, came back up at 8 o'clock in the morning. And by the next morning, somebody had been up and down that trench with a metal detector and pulled out all sorts of bits and pieces, because they'd just thrown them to the side of the trench. And there was things like Stokes mortars, grenades, because it's full of metal, of course, but they were just pulling stuff out, and obviously things they didn't want went on the side of the trench. And, thankfully, we'd removed the bodies, but what we had left behind, because we said we'll get them in the morning, is a Mauser rifle and a Lee Enfield rifle, which were underneath this chap. And we said, well, okay, we got the important thing, which is the body, but we'll deal with the rest of the stuff. And those had disappeared overnight. And this is like, as I say, it must have been within an hour of us leaving. And you could tell it was metal detecting because there were literally holes dotted up and down the trench line where we'd already pulled our trench with a digger. So incredibly frustrating, because the thing is, we've identified several sets of human remains over the years, and we've got them from things like literally from a guy. One of the first ones we got was a guy, he'd scratched his name onto the back of his dog tag, and it's a tiny little piece of tin, that is so thin that without proper archaeological lifting would have just been destroyed. It would fall into pieces in our hands. So had a metal detectorist found, the British guy we pulled out probably wouldn't have had a dog tag, because they were, as you know, pressed material, so they would have disappeared. But a German one possibly could have still been around, which could have led to an ID for that body. In that case, there's probably very little chance of it, but there's still that problem that it could have happened. So yeah, so it was incredibly disappointing, and what that meant was that we kind of reassessed how we did things. And that was kind of the point where we said, right, okay, if something turns up, we work on it until it is finished and we get everything out from around that area, because you might even be able to ID the guy from the number on his Lee Enfield. I know it's like, it's a bit of a needle in a haystack, but there's a possibility, that he might well be there. So we kind of thought, right, this is what we have to do. Now, unfortunately, what happened was on the Thursday, we were going home on Friday, we found what turned out to be a mass burial of German soldiers.
Gosh.
And so we ended up in the field basically on Thursday. We were going to be packing up on Friday. We'd got, ferries booked on Friday night and that kind of thing. We were all going home for the weekend. But because we'd already said, well, we can't just leave these things up here because somebody with a metal detector, and then we know that it's disturbing bones. So we worked on those through the night, and the team kind of took it in turns. Basically, we half of us stayed up, did a couple of hours work while the others went home and slept, and then they came back later on. And I was one of the ones that stayed up overnight until about 3 or 4 in the morning. And it was probably one of the hardest things I've ever done in archaeology, because you're trying to excavate remains, you're trying to record them, you're trying to do as much as you can and stay awake, in the middle of a field in the middle of the night, because we just didn't have security. We didn't think about it at the time. And then the runner for the TV show sent out for. He went out to go and get some food and stuff for us and brought it back, and we literally we had no washing facilities or anything, and we'd been up to our arms literally in dead Germans, and all he could find was pizza, and we had no cutlery. So it's the hardest I've ever worked, and it's probably the closest I've ever come to cannibalism as well. But I'd try not to think about that too much these days.
Yes. But I guess that when something's new like that, the kind of whole approach to it, these are all things that you learn by doing this kind of work, is that, the thought that somebody would gate crash, an archaeological project just for a few bits of who knows what. I mean, it's just extraordinary, really, when it comes to the recovery of human remains.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's rust and dust, and it's going to end up on eBay, or it's going to end up on somebody's shelf or something. You know what I mean? For what? The chance of identifying somebody from the First World War, and as I said, we on that site, in fact, we identified quite a number of those Germans in that pit, and there was another one as well. There was another German laid out in a grave on his own. I think it's called George Martin, I think, if I remember correctly. And he was ID'd through his wedding rings, his parents' wedding rings that he'd got round his neck, he'd been buried with. And so, yeah, at least tiny little things like that, that a metal detector would pick up, but also might just be cast to one side because it's not, in inverted commas, from the war, because it's just it's not a rifle or a grenade or something, But so yeah, and the set, we actually went back to Lewes because we actually knew that, I said that, we tried our best to get as many men out of that grave. We knew there was at least one more in there. But so what we did, we marked it with tarpaulin, got a GPS point on it. And when Yap Films, who did Finding the Fallen, came back and said, do you want to do a second series? We said yes, but the whole team all together said, we do, but we have to go back to Lewes because we know there's somebody in the ground still. It turns out there was about another 3 or 4 of them in the ground.
Gosh.
But what happened was we were able to then employ some security to come up and look after the site overnight. And we were able just to work in the daytime, knowing exactly where those bodies were. We went straight to them and we were able to recover them, and they are now buried in German military cemeteries. I think they're down at Metz, if I remember correctly. So, they are now with their comrades, at least, and we were able to get 1 or 2 names in the bodies that we pulled out from various bits and pieces that they got in their pockets and things. So yeah, it was a steep learning curve, shall we say, a little bit like the British Army between 1914 and 18. But we got there, in the end, and that was there were stumbles, but like you said, because things like this we hadn't done anything like this before. We were just kind of feeling our way in the dark, and it's very different now. Like for example, the Hill 80 excavations would have been handled very differently to what we were doing, 20 odd years ago.
I mean, I saw it with the diggers. I mean, they never claimed to be archaeologists. They were metal detectorists who kind of suddenly found themselves in a project that they couldn't even have imagined the kind of scope and size of it. But then, a decade later, we were working with Simon Verdigam, filming his dig at Messines, which was his first really big dig. And to see the kind of methodology that he was using there, and the process and the security and the way human remains were treated and what could and couldn't be done. I mean, both in Forgotten Battlefield and also in your series, they show the human remains being excavated, and then subsequently there was a kind of decision in television that wouldn't ever happen again. So, which I think is not necessarily a good thing. We want dignity in death, but I think sometimes people do also have to be reminded of just how terrible death in the First World War could be, really, in terms of what it does to the soldiers that are buried in all those cemeteries.
Yeah, I see both sides because, from a professional point of view, from an archaeological point of view, there is a certain morbid curiosity about dead bodies, across everybody, really. So the profession as a whole have kind of tightened up a little bit on it. And, even in commercial archaeology or in, professional archaeology, they will put up boards around sites where there are skeletons. So, the public don't see them as well, because you also don't know how people react to it as well. There's all kinds of things like that. So it's a two-way thing. I understand what you're saying as well. And I kind of agree with you, but I also, I see it from the other side of it as well, from the, my profession side of things as well, and how we deal with it. But yeah, the difference. I mean, Belgium, it changed anyway. I think it was a signatory of, I think it's the Valletta Convention, which kind of made the archaeology much more. Trying to think of the word, because they were already professional, but it made it commercial. So when we started working in Belgium, it was through the Flanders Institute, and they were, like a council archaeological group. So they would go and excavate things if they had a chance to do stuff, and they were very small, and they had a lot of workers who weren't archaeologists with them, but they had an archaeologist who kind of run the site. Whereas after, I can't remember the dates of it, but it'd be about 2010-ish. After then, Belgium became more like the UK in that they have a commercial archaeology way of working, where any scheme that goes in has to be excavated beforehand. And that was one of the things I was involved in 2014 was the flux pipeline. That went through a lot of the old battlefields. So I was doing some machine watching out there for a week or so, just as part of, I just got on that job. But there was a huge amount of First World War stuff done, and that was all done by commercial archaeologists. And that was something that 10, 15 years previously, the institute probably just would not have been able to handle because of the vast amount of work that it would have entailed. But because they were in this new ratification of I'm sure it's the Valletta Convention. I could be wrong, but they basically meant that they had to look after the archaeology from a commercial point of view as well. So yeah, huge changes just in Belgium in those 20 years that I've worked there back and forth.
And having seen the kind of progression of that archaeology, I mean, one of the things that I've encountered sometimes when I've spoken to people about this, as an historian looking at archaeologists doing their work, and they say, well, what's the point of it? We know everything about the First World War. It's all written down. We've got photographs and we've got everything. It's not like Roman times, etc. I just kind of wonder what you think about statements like that.
Well, that's always a question, isn't it? But the thing is, there is a lot of stuff written about the First World War. Of course, there is. It's a massive. There's vast quantities of written documentation on the First World War. But what they don't write about is the stuff that they leave behind, the rubbish, what they're doing with it. All those little bits and pieces, the human touch of it, really. The small stuff that is just every day to everybody else. So, for example, let me give you an example here. We were up at Tierval, we were excavating there, and we it was basically a dugout. I think it must have been used as a latrine at some point because there was a bunch of religious papers that had been ripped out of a religious pamphlet that were obviously being used for some kind of toilet paper.
Gosh.
Now, you don't find that in the poetry, do you? And that's not in the... that doesn't come across in diaries and things. So, we're looking really at the minutiae of the war. The stuff, as I say, you look at a shell crater, see what kind of things have been left behind in there. And it's only the same as with, a Roman villa or any other archaeological site or feature. We're looking at the stuff that has been thrown away by people. I mean, archaeology is literally sifting through the ancient rubbish because, once it's in the ground, they obviously don't want it anymore. If it was any good, they would have kept it. That's my catch line when it comes to archaeology. But we, jokes aside, we also, the point of excavating the human remains in the way that we do from a professional point of view is, as I've already mentioned, we then are able to find those tiny little fragments that can put a name onto those bones. And, one of the most powerful ones, I think, was probably the first guy that we ever found, Jakob Honnis, a German soldier from... he was at Serre. He'd been fighting at Serre in 1915 when the French had attacked. He'd been killed then. And we'd got from the rolls through Ralph Whitehead over in America. He'd done quite a lot of work on that. But I think it's the 112th Infantry Regiment.
Yeah, 26th Reserve Division, the Württembergers, I think, aren't they?
Yes. Yeah, that's right. And Jakob had belonged to them. He was like 34 years old, been called back to the colours. And we were just excavating. We were looking for something else. We were looking for Wilfred Owen's dugout. It's a long story, but that was down at Serre on the Heidenkopf. And but we found 3 bodies, one of which was Jakob, and he was a guy that I was talking about, where he'd scratched his name onto the back of his dog tag, and without doing this archaeologically, we would have never found that dog tag because it would literally just disappear under somebody's hands. We had to be incredibly careful to pick it out, and the fact that the numbers on the dog tag had disappeared, so there was nothing left of that. But his scratching was on there, and it was, the guys down at UECL looked at it, and his son was still alive. Gosh. When we got in touch with the family through our German contacts. His son was something like 93, but literally 6 weeks after we'd got in touch with him, he died. So we were able, this is a guy, and I think he must have died. His father must have died when, I can't remember the name of the son, but he must have been about 3 or 4, and will have never have known his father. And his father's basically in this unknown grave in the middle of France, in a forgotten field, literally, until we came along and were able to identify him. And then at the end of his life, we were kind of able to give him a bit of closure on where his father had been all those years.
Incredible.
So, so when people say, it doesn't tell us anything, doesn't do anything, you got to think, archaeology is about humans. That's the human touch right there, really. You can't get any more human than that. And, the thing with Jakob was amazing because it was the first. I think it was he was. If it wasn't him, it was there was a British guy there as well. But either one of them were the first remains that we were working on as archaeologists, because all in Averils it was just a trench. It wasn't there was no human remains in there, but this was frontline stuff, so it was a bit different. So again, it kind of gave us a bit of a spurt from an archaeological point of view that there is a lot more to this than we were kind of expecting anyway. But also, it gave us our protocols as well as dealing with human remains when we found them in the field as well. And as I say, this kind of went on with other things that came up, like the metal detectoring and stuff. But we were also able to source photographs of Jakob and his house and things like that, and
Wow.
photograph of him and his platoon and his brother in the platoon. And you can't do that with a medieval skeleton.
No.
I've dug hundreds of them at this point, in various cemeteries and things across the country, and they will always remain a set of human bones, and that's all they will ever be. Very, very rarely will you actually find a named personality prior to about the 18th century, and so you just don't get it in archaeology. And that, again, the fact that you can look at a photograph of somebody who you have literally lifted out of the ground 90 years after their death, it's still mind-blowing to me now, and sends shivers through me when I think about it.
And with that kind of story with someone like Jakob, you're kind of retelling the First World War through his personal journey, aren't you? To that point where he disappears into that field in northern France, and that echoes the terrible fate of so many families who never knew what happened to these men.
Exactly that. I mean, there are so many sets of human remains out there. So many bodies that were just never recovered, never identified, and it'd be impossible to identify every single body you find as an archaeologist. So there are very few situations where that is that's possible. Somewhere like Fromelles was probably the closest that you would ever get to it, and that was through DNA, and that's because they knew the names of a lot of the soldiers in there anyway, so they were able to contact families and things. Also, it's very expensive to do DNA testing, so we always have to do any identification through things that they have on them. So, and you don't always find stuff on. One of the other guys we found up at Lewes, he'd got a bank book, and he was the only chap from that a particular unit who was from that town that bank book was from. So we were then able to put two and two together and say, well, we're not getting five here. This has definitely got to be this guy, pretty much. Who else would have a bank account in that town if they're not from it? That kind of thing. So there's a lot of forensic archaeology from that point of view as well that goes into it, thinking about it and stuff. But you're never going to identify everybody, but there's also a chance that you might identify the body that you're working on. So you just have to be very careful with it, and really take your time and be as professional as possible around those remains, because any tiny little thing could give you their name, and then that gives them a grave. And as you say, they are no longer then in just in a shell hole in France for 90 years.
And then later on, I think you worked at Bullecourt, I think, didn't you, with the project there? Is that right?
Mm-hmm. That's correct. That's through my boss, Richard Osgood. He's now my boss. He wasn't at the time, but he is now. He's probably regretting ever taking me on, but we are where we are.
I can't believe that's true.
But yeah, he set that up because I did work with him at Mamay Woods. That was another TV thing. We were looking for just the. That was with Gareth Thomas, the Welsh rugby star, because I think one of his ancestors had fought at Mamay Woods. So we were excavating there, and that was through what's called Operation Nightingale, which is a project I'm now involved with in work, where we get veterans suffering PTSD and various combat injuries involved in archaeology, because it's very good as a route towards recovery. Really, it's because there's teamwork in archaeology. There is the just scraping away with a trowel can take you away from all world's ills when the sun is shining on you. It's the attention to detail will take you away, and a lot of the guys that have come through the Op Nightingale stuff, and we've had probably several hundred at this point. I've always said there is a benefit to it from a mental health point of view. So this is something that I do in my day job anyway. So I do one of these once a year. But Richard had set up the Bulleco project off the back of the Mamet stuff. And this was really to go looking for the Mark II tanks that attacked there in April of 1917 in support of the Australians, because there's quite a lot of aerial photos of them when they were destroyed on the. I think most of them were destroyed in the fighting, weren't they? And again, you can probably fill me in there a little bit, but I think there was something like 11 or 12 that went into action, and
pretty much all of them got knocked out, didn't they? Coming over the railway embankment at Bullecourt and then moving into that. Right. It was a vast open space where that bit of the Hindenburg line was, with no cover, and they were sitting ducks for artillery fire, really, weren't they?
Yeah, they certainly were, and it was snowing as well, wasn't it? And these things were painted. Well, we found out what colour they were painted because we actually found on the first year we'd been to Bullecourt about 4 years at this by now, I think. Where we found 12-foot length of track of 796 tank, which was, if memory serves, it was commanded by Lieutenant Skinner, and that had got literally to the edge of the Hindenburg line before being knocked out. And our photographer Harvey was able to do some colour testing on the remains of the paint, because there was still paint on it, and it was a dark green, which was almost British racing green.
Wow.
Which kind of feels a little bit like taking a piss when the tank only does 4 miles an hour. But
yeah.
But I mean, these things were rushed to the front anyway, because they were training tanks, were the Mark IIs, and because they were being made by down in Lincoln, it was
Foster's, was it?
Foster's, yeah, that's right. And they're an agricultural company, weren't they? So they probably just had loads of green paint kicking around and just painted these things in this dark green, which, when they're attacking in a snowstorm, also almost gives them a black silhouette. So, literally, a German artillery officer that can't hit a target like that really needs to rethink his trade, I think. But, they were... in Charles Bean's accounts of the battles afterwards, he was quite dismissive of the tanks and their supporting role. And I mean, to be fair to them, they'd only just entered service less than 6 months previously. It's September, wasn't it, 1916, that the first tanks were used. So they're still learning how to use these things. And, they, as we all know, they were awful inside anyway, really difficult to operate. You can't hear anything, can't see anything, you're getting carbon monoxide poisoning, all that stuff. But for the fact that this one got all the way up to the Hindenburg line before being knocked out is a miracle in and of itself. So I think he was a little bit harsh on these things. And we also found as well, this is something that I've, in the 20 years I've done field archaeology and on the battlefields, is I've never seen the casing of a shell. I've seen plenty of the ends of shells, the fusers and the front. I can't remember the name of it. Come to me. The front end of the shell.
The round with the fuse on. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. That stuff. But the brass bit of it, because it's left behind in the gun, because you're not excavating gun positions. That's like 2 miles behind the front lines. You never see it. But we actually found the 6-pounder shell casing that was in that tank, and it had been fired. So they were actually firing their gun as they were going. And what was also interesting, because I'm sure you know this as well, anyway, Paul, you have a head stamp on the end of munitions. That had actually been made in April of 1917. Wow. So less than a week previously, this shell had gone from Britain in a shell factory somewhere out to France, stuck into a tank, and then in the attack. So you can kind of tell this real rushed kind of story about these tanks being pushed into something that they probably just were not ready for. But you've got this incredibly brave crew that are fighting right to the end, using their weapons, up against the German Hindenburg line. So they're doing their thing. So I kind of think Charles Bean gave them a bit of a bit of bad shrift, really, for what they were doing, really.
Well, Charles
And
Bean was the one that told us that every Australian was a 6 foot bronzed bushman. So, whereas,
well, yeah, I mean, I was trying to be nice. I'm not. I don't want to attack him too much, but yeah.
I mean, they're beautifully written books. I mean, I've read
Mm,
them, read
mm.
bits of them many times. They're not books you can read from cover to cover necessarily, but they're certainly accounts of the battles are great. But it's, every official historian or unofficial historian kind of has their angle, I guess. But
Of course, yeah, yeah.
yeah.
And yeah, I mean, he's an Australian writing about Australians that failed to do their job whilst being supported by British tanks. Who do we blame? The British tanks, of course,
The old British Tommies. But I mean, thankfully, Monash didn't share that view. So when it came to
Yeah, that's true.
1918, he embraced tanks and really got the Australians to embrace tanks as well.
Mm. Oh yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think they had, yeah, they didn't really like tanks so much after Bullecourt, did they? But then, yes,
No,
it kind of changed in 18. But the tanks changed anyway, didn't they? By
yeah.
1918, anyway, they've got the Mark fours and fives and all those things, and that in itself is interesting. But I mean, we were kind of almost able to retell the story of Bullecourt again through archaeology, through that human connection of that you don't see it written in the official histories. So when you ask what is battlefield archaeology for, there's another answer for you.
Yeah, well, I think that's an important part of it, isn't it? Really.
Mm.
So, kind of thinking that all the things that you've done on the battlefield, kind of, I guess we're on our journey now from battlefield to tabletop and wargaming, and I think a lot of people probably perhaps don't know what wargaming is. So, I guess from the point of view of this discussion, it's probably a good idea to kind of define it. Some it's computer gaming, shooting people up on Call of Duty and stuff like that, but there's a much older tradition of wargaming involving tabletops and then figures on those tabletops, isn't there?
That's right. I mean, the first real war game, I suppose, was the Kriegspiel that the Prussian High Command were playing in the late 19th century. That's kind of where it kind of originates. But then H.G. Wells wrote a book called Little Wars, which was basically to allow. I think it was for boys and certain types of girls, is what he actually says in it. But basically, to get
Oh
your toy
gosh.
soldiers, wouldn't pass muster these days, but it was to get your toy soldiers out and basically blast them with matchstick firing cannons and things. And it was a very simple set of rules. But then that kind of developed in the really after the Second World War and in the 50s and the 60s, probably more 60s, with a lot of the veterans from the Second World War and also the explosion in plastic soldiers of the airfix stuff. So, I'm sure a lot of people listening to this will be aware at least of airfix soldiers. And there was a lot of people like Donald Featherstone, Charles Grant, quite a few others that were writing around that. Tony Bath, I can't remember who else. There's a list of these
Peter Young was
guys.
another one, wasn't he?
That's
Brigadier
right,
Peter
Peter
Young,
Young.
yeah.
Yeah. And Paddy Griffiths as well. He was also
Yeah.
involved in it from
Mhm.
that. And they started developing rules, basically for refighting battles on your tabletop. And a lot of these things, because these were ex-military soldiers, a lot of them were, they'd probably done war games anyway, just not in name in their military times, because any exercise that you do is a war game. Really, it's just with bigger soldiers, real soldiers. But so it kind of probably came from that. Really, a lot of these guys, I'd say, were ex-army, ex-military, should I say, and they started to kind of codify rules for games. A lot of these things are still in place today. A lot of this stuff we just cannot get rid of, unfortunately, in some cases. But I think they were working out things like how fast a Prussian line regiment would march in 2.5 minutes, and then work out what your ground scale is on your 6 foot by 4 foot table, and that's how many inches that unit would move in a turn, kind of thing. Obviously, not taking into any account anything that would happen to that unit in that movement, but that's another story. But so it kind of and now the hobby is massive. It is huge, and again, even if people aren't aware of wargaming, they're probably aware of Games Workshop or Warhammer, as it's known, which is on the high street of pretty much every town here, at least in the UK, and it is multinational corporation, but they're massive. Now that's more fantasy wargaming, So that'd be more like Lord of the Rings style stuff. So you have elves and orcs and that kind of thing. But they also have sci-fi versions of it as well, which are very, very popular. But there is a whole side of wargaming, which is historical wargaming, which is what I'm interested in. And when I say historical, I mean literally everything from Paleolithic up to future wars, So anything, anywhere where somebody's got anything more than a pointy stick and jabbed it into somebody else, you can wargame pretty much. So, that's kind of like I suppose that's the potted history of wargaming up to now, really, and it is huge. I mean, we mentioned just before we came on that we saw each other at Salute last, which is I think if not one of the biggest, it is probably the biggest wargaming convention, at least in the UK.
One of the oldest, I would have thought as well. I think.
Yeah, it's just I think it's 53 years it's been going this year.
Gosh.
And I think they had something like 6 or 7,000 people through the door last year. So it's incredibly popular, and that's just the people that go to that one show. That's not the people across the country that wargame as well, who don't go to Salute. But it's also pretty big in America as well. It was a British invention because we've got H.G. Wells and all the other guys in the 60s were British pretty much. But it has, it's got a big following in America as well. And yeah, I mean, the hobby itself is, at its core, you are recreating battles on the tabletop using toy soldiers. There are various different scales, from everything from 54mm high figures down to 6mm and 2mm high figures, depending on the scale of the game or the battle that you're fighting. And you do it with various different rules. There's lots of different rules out there that various people will argue to the death about which are the best and which are the worst, and everybody has a list. But this also involves painting those figures, researching the figures, researching the uniforms, researching the vehicles, the tanks, all that kind of stuff, and painting it all, making the scenery, all that kind of thing. It's a vast hobby in and of itself. It's not just about playing the game. You've got to kind of prepare stuff before you get to that playing of the game.
And I think that's what will surprise a lot of people is that, I look at the stuff on your channel and you've got some amazing scenery that you've created for all the different kind of periods that you war game. And that scenery, I think, since, when I war game first as a kid in the 70s through all the different Airfix books, and there was a book called Battle for Wargamers and stuff like that. It was kind of, you cut roads out of bits of card and rivers out of blue card, and you just used the Airfix plastic British houses as anything like that. But now, particularly with 3D printing, you can just about have anything that you want, can't you? And these tabletops can be amazing.
Yeah, if you can imagine it, you can print it. Basically, as long as you've got somebody who can sculpt it in whatever 3D, it's a massive revolution, the 3D printing. And as you say, you go to a show like Salute or Partisan up at Newark, and the amount of work that people put into those tables to show them off literally for a day it's mind blowing. I'm always humbled by the amount of stuff that's out there that you just think, God, you could dip into any kind of period. And literally every period in history is covered at some point by wargaming, and somebody will have probably played it as well, and probably have a display show of it at Partisan or something, So
yeah.
these weird little, like Indian revolutions from the 16th century or something. Somebody's wargaming it, and it's... So yeah, I try to stay... There's a name for wargamers who are butterflies, who will just pick and choose lots of different bits and pieces. I try to stay within 3 main periods, and that's the First and Second World Wars and the Napoleonic Wars. And most of that kind of goes back to my childhood, watching Waterloo on a Sunday afternoon, and just getting interested in the Napoleonic Wars through that, and the Second World War through watching stuff like Bridge Too Far and those kind of films and things. The one that stands out is probably the First World War, and that I got interested in that after getting involved with the First World War archaeology.
So when I look at, the kind of the periods that are wargamed and the stuff that's on your channel, World War II is a big kind of thing, isn't it, really, for wargaming now? And on one level, that's it's not easy, but it's easier to do because it's a mobile war. There's a lot of kind of stuff out there. The battlefields are kind of fairly simple. They can be crops, vast open fields in Russia, D-Day beaches, or whatever. But wargaming the First World War potentially is a bit more problematic, isn't it?
It can be, and it's always kind of been seen like that, which is quite. I think it does a massive disservice to it. I always think back to it's not Charles Grant. It's Don Featherstone's book, and I think it's called something like Wargaming Through the Ages. I had a copy of it. I got rid of it a while ago because I was just having a clear out. But I was looking through it, and it gives a chapter to a wargaming period. So like you have the Roman period, it's got like the chapters are 20, 30 pages. The Napoleonic Wars is a 40-page long chapter. The Franco-Prussian Wars gets another 20 pages. Second World War, 60 pages. First World War, 4 pages. And it's kind of like it almost says, well, you can do aeroplanes, and you can probably do the stuff in 1914 and the stuff in 1918 when things are moving, but everything else, they're just kind of looking at each other for 3 years. And you know this, Paul, and I know this, and probably people who are listening to your podcast know this, that the stuff in between, to me, it's the most interesting bit anyway. But there is so much movement and so much development and tactical development and weapons development that's going on. It's probably been one of the most developed, or the highest level of developments of any modern war, I would have said, just because of the stuff that was happening and being tried out because of the situation of the trenches. And there is an issue in that, when you have trench warfare, you kind of want to have your trenches dug into the ground. You can't always do that with a 6x4 flat table. But there are some companies out there that do trenches that are raised above the ground, and they kind of have a bit of a slope into the front of them, so they look as though they blend into the table a bit more. And I use some of the ones from a company called Early War Miniatures. They make some of the best ones, I think. But there's plenty of them out there, so you can kind of simulate the trenches if you want to. They're not perfect. But there are also a lot of people who make trench boards anyway with the trenches dug into the ground, so they look a little bit more, shall we say, realistic than the other ones that are above ground. But that does take a lot of work, and also you've got to store those things as well. Big 2 foot by 2 foot board with a trench in it. It takes up a lot of storeroom. But a lot of people, and when I say a lot of people, I mean a lot of wargamers have that kind of perception that the public have of the First World War, in that basically everybody gets out their trenches, walks towards German machine guns, and everybody's dead within 10 minutes kind of thing. And again, as you know, as I know, and as the listeners know, that can't be further from the truth, especially from after mid-1916 onwards. So I got into the First World War stuff through the First World War excavations, through working on the battlefields. And I thought, because I started to learn more about the war itself and how it was fought and those developments and, the tumultuous time that it was, I thought this is actually ripe for wargaming. This is perfect for wargaming. And I then went out and bought myself a ton of Peter Pig's 15mm First World War figures, literally off the back of, excavating. And I think it was actually some TV money that paid for them. So
good use of it.
Yeah. Battlefield Archaeology paid out at the end. But then, I looked around for other rules as well. And there was also the Two Fat Lardies set of rules called Through the Mud and the Blood, which is really opened my eyes to their kind of rules as well. And, they're a company that write rules and have done for 20 years, just over, I think. It's their 20th anniversary. But they are my favourite rules writers, and Through the Mud and the Blood is one of my favourite games. It took a long while for me to get my head into it, because it wasn't, as I was talking about the old wargamers, it wasn't a traditional wargame in the sense that they'd written in the 60s, which a lot of people were still kind of reusing their stuff. They'd completely changed how things operate, and it was really about command and control and about what they called big men, or the leaders, so the corporals and up. And it was all about those people and getting the other ranks to do stuff. And it blew my mind that you could do this with wargaming, and that it fits really well with the First World War and at least what I understand as the First World War, and the fighting that went on.
And the purpose of the rule sets for those who don't know really know what wargaming is that
Yeah, sorry,
you're
getting ahead of
not.
myself.
No. I mean, it's not like we're not doing the HG Wells with matchsticks anymore, firing them or making kind of noises that we did when we were kids, when we were fighting these kind of battles with unpainted Airfix figures. But
Sometimes you can't help it, but
you can't help it, no. But it's to kind of give a structure, and I guess to replicate things like fog of war and chance. And for that, you're using dice, aren't you, normally, and other mechanisms.
yeah, absolutely. So yeah, you are using. I mentioned it. Like the marching length of a Prussian line infantry regiment. You can work out how far they're supposed to move, and you can say, okay, well, that's 6 inches on the tabletop. So each turn they will move 6 inches. Your opponent can do the same. You generally. The most basic war game would be you were playing turns. You're playing against a player. You will probably have a move phase in which you move your units. You will then have a firing phase, which you fire those units. You may have a melee phase if anybody's in close combat. You might have a morale phase where you roll to see how they are, what they're doing. If they're going to stand and fight, or if they're going to start falling back, or whatever. And a lot of war games kind of are centered around those. That's the most basic way of explaining it. You're kind of moving through turns, so it's a bit like a board game where each person is taking a turn and they're able to do a certain amount in that turn with those units. And these have, the rules have massively developed over the past 50, 60 years that this has been going on. As I say, the very simple early rules were literally that: you move, you fire, you do your melee, your charges or whatever, But things have kind of moved on a little bit, and people try to do things a little bit differently these days.
And in those days, people took turns, didn't they? It was like, I go, you go. So it was almost like a gentleman's war. After you, old chap, I think it's your turn to charge. Whereas I think the more modern rules try to replicate the reality of a battlefield where no one gets to choose the circumstances of battle.
Absolutely, yeah. That's exactly the phrase for it. Is I go, you go. So it's basically I would move and fire and everything on my turn. Then you would get to do the same thing on your turn, and then we go back and forth until the battle is decided. But now, as you said, there's a lot of rules where friction and fog of war has been taken into account. Friction in particular, and this is where, from my point of view, the two fat lardies who wrote Through Them Under Blood and Chain of Command and a few other games that I play. This is where I firmly planted my flag, because I'm interested in the fog and the friction of war, and they very much emphasize that in their games. So even down to, I mentioned, sometimes you'll have a unit that will move 6 inches. It's going to move 6 inches every turn. In a Two Fat Lardies game, you roll dice to see how far you get. And what that replicates is not only the troops either not wanting to go forward or going further forward than you expected, but also it's when the enemy interrupts them, because it kind of makes time a little bit elastic. Whereas in the older rules, the I go, you go, it says, well, this is 15 minutes worth of real time, so everything happens in this 15-minute block, and then you do something in your 15-minute block. Whereas in Two Fat Lardies rules, it's like, well, this could be a minute, this could be 10 seconds, this could be 20 minutes. You don't know how long that bound of time is going to be. So it makes it applies friction to a tabletop, which is difficult to do. But it also applies the fog of war as well, because you don't always have all your troops on the table from the start of the game. Again, traditional war games, you would have your entire army on the table. They would have their entire army on the table, so you'd know where everybody is, you know where everyone's moving about. Whereas with Two Fat Lardies in particular, they used their older system was a system of what's called blinds, where you would have cardboard pieces on the table, and the enemy doesn't know what they are. And they may be dummies. There might be a unit, it might be a platoon of British infantry, or it might be a dummy unit, and you don't know that until you spot that blind. They now have different systems for that. So now in Chain of Command, they have a thing called a jumping off point, where you play a little game before the game to get your jumping off points, but you may not use all those jumping off points. You may just, be, you're not sure if the enemy has got something in that jumping off point. And so that adds your friction and your fog of war into the game as well, really. So, yeah, I mean, there's a massive development in wargaming rules these days, and there are so many to choose from. It is mind-boggling how many there are out there. I mean, I've mentioned Too Fat Lardis. They're not the biggest company, but they're a very well known company. I mean, one of the biggest companies is a company called Warlord, and they have a Second World War game called Bolt Action, which is very, very popular. It's kind of popular because it's easy to get into. You can basically buy a box of figures and the rules for about £100, and you'll once you've built the figures and painted them or whatever, you'll have enough for a game, and then you add to that from other figures and things. So that's quite partially why they're popular. But they also cover other periods as well. So yeah, I mean it's a thing that if you start to dip your toe into, you could probably end up spinning around a bit and getting lost a little bit. But there is a lot of companies that do make box sets to get people started in the hobby, and I recommend it to anybody because it's great fun.
And there is a kind of the fun element to it with the modelling, with the gaming. And some people, there are tournaments, aren't there, where people kind of battle away for trophies and prizes and all that kind of stuff. But the kind of way that you describe how these more modern rules operate, they're kind of prompting players, whether they realise it or not, to make the same kind of battlefield decisions that real commanders would have to do. That if you make the wrong decision and you don't have reserves, or you send the men up the wrong flank, or you send them out into the open where the enemy's entrenched, the outcomes are going to be similar outcomes to if you were trying to do that with real people, and therefore end up causing huge casualties, for example, to your side. So that's kind of where it gets interesting, isn't it? Because that makes it applicable to something else, a kind of a learning process with history, where we can learn about history in another way.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think, again, to champion the Too Fat Lardis in this is very much their ethos, is looking at period training manuals. So for Through the Mud and the Blood, it's one of the very few war games out there that actually uses, the organisations of the time of those platoons. And it is very much about getting your junior officers and your sergeants in the right place at the right time, so that when their card comes up, they can command a certain number of units around them. Otherwise, those units on their own generally don't do a huge amount. So it's really about having to think about it. And this is, as you say, this is it is the situations that those lieutenants and second lieutenants and sergeants found themselves in 1718, when they were trying to get their platoons to coordinate to attack German strongpoints, for example. And you have to think about that. And if you do it, the rules don't make you do that, but they nudge you in a certain way that, if, like you say, literally, if you don't do that, then you will end up, with more casualties than you can count. Otherwise, if you try to get that coordination going on and get everything in the right place at the right time, and just, bide your time and wait until the right moment, you can, achieve your victory. And again, this is something that appeals to me from their writing and from the Too Fat Lardis stuff, more so than a lot of other games where that side of it, they're more like games rather than tactical simulations, I guess. And I prefer the tactical simulation side of things. So you mentioned like tournaments. That's, Bolt Action, you can play it as a tournament because you will have a certain set of points worth of as an army. So you can fight against an army that is also of equal points, and the two should be, in inverted commas, balanced. But again, the Too Fat Lardis stuff, there's no balance in it. You are fighting unequal from the get-go. You just have to make the best with the cards that you're dealt, basically.
And that's what real war is. I mean, no unit in the First World War ever fought a battle in perfect circumstances where they had exactly the right number of men, exactly the right number of guns, tanks, everything else to defeat the enemy in front of them. War doesn't work like that.
No. I mean, there is the 3-to-1 adage that you have to outnumber your enemy 3-to-1 to be able to destroy them. How many times does that happen? I mean, look at Waterloo. They were pretty equally matched in numbers, the British and the French armies. That's not a 3-to-1 advantage, is it, on nobody's side?
No.
But still, the battle was fought. You know what I mean? So yeah, reality doesn't always reflect what what the doctrine, or at least what the rules of war are supposed to be. And this comes across, as you say, with a friction that's built into these rules. And it's the thing that interests me the most about the First World War, or one of the things that interests me the most, is that command control communication, the issues that they had. because you've got, what is literally a modern war, but no way of talking to the men once they were over the bags. And, you can emulate that a little, because then you've got to rely on your junior officers and your sergeants to get those men forward. It's not like a battalion commander can see what's happening once everything's kicking off. So yeah, it's more of a simulation than a game, but it's still a game and it's still great fun.
Yeah. And the interesting thing with the simulation side of it is that it's not just the crazy wargamers like us that do this, but armed forces across the world are, again, just like in the past, are adopting wargaming as a way for military personnel to learn about future war, whatever that is. And with going back to kind of the Great War, with what is happening in Ukraine with trench warfare there, lessons of trench warfare, all of a sudden, 100 years on, suddenly become applicable again. So the kind of warfare that, is depicted in the games on your channel and all these different rule sets suddenly becomes something that is of interest to modern service personnel as well.
Absolutely. I mean, yeah, we on the training ranges of the MOD, they have been digging trenches for the last few years. A lot of this is going on, like you said, literally going back to the First World War, because of how they've seen the fighting, the lessons learned from the fighting in Ukraine that is, literally happening now, which 20 years ago would have been unimaginable. But right now, it's a thing that is happening. That we are gathering information from and using for the future, because that's how the future war is going to be for, the old future war kind of thing. And yeah, the military do use wargaming as well at various levels. I mean, as I say, I kind of joked earlier, but any exercise is a war game, because they are, they're working out what the outcomes are going to be of certain contacts with the enemy. So that is literally a war game. They're just using live soldiers to do it, but they also do it at staff college as well. Where they're taught various exercises and things like that as well. So yeah, the military use it. They generally don't push toy soldiers about, but they, it's been persuaded once or twice. And a friend of mine, Tom, he's a major in the Irish Army. He's currently in Shrivenham at the moment at Staff College, and he's he's an absolute crazy wargamer. He loves it, and he tries to get his officer mates to join his massive games of bolt action every so often, and they're brilliant when they do. And a lot of veterans that I've worked with as well have had an interest in wargaming. I've always kind of half toyed with the idea of setting up a veterans wargaming association somewhere during one of our Operation Nightingale project things, because I think people would benefit from it, because they've already got that interest from a military point of view. But yeah,
I think that'd be a great idea, yeah, because I mean, I kind of think, going back to what you were saying about Op Nightingale and how that's beneficial for ex-service personnel, particularly those struggling with PTSD and mental health issues, that you kind of see that those kind of phrases being used more and more with wargaming as well. There was a report, I think, in Yorkshire recently about a club set up for guys who were struggling with mental health, and the painting side of it, which again is about attention to detail, isn't it? Was all kind of really good and useful for people with those kind of issues.
That's right. Yeah, I think they're called Dad's War Room, I think. I was just into an interview with them on another podcast, Yorkshire Gamers podcast, which is a wargaming podcast, and they have I think it's in Hull, I think it is, and it's a couple of guys, and literally just set up in almost a village hall. They got a load of basically figures in for some people to paint if they don't want a game, and they said they didn't know, they set it up, didn't know what to expect, and they were flooded with people that came down just to see what was happening, and it's going from strength to strength by the sounds of it, and yeah, as you say, they were doing it very specifically for mental health reasons, or for trying to help people with mental health issues. And these things like Operation Nightingale, you can never look at these things as a full recovery from mental health, but it's a pathway towards it, and it helps. And if you can help somebody just for a couple of hours on a Wednesday or Thursday night or whatever, just not think about other things, and just to get their head into doing something hobby wise, I think it's a brilliant thing to do, I think.
Yeah, I mean, they're kind of building blocks in our lives, aren't they, really, that we're with people with similar interests, similar backgrounds, sharing, perhaps similar issues, and you can learn a lot from each other and understand a lot from each other through the process of archaeology, wargaming, and kind of a lot of other things besides. And it's not just guys; it's not just young men like you and old geezers like me doing
Young man,
wargaming.
I'm 50, Paul. I'm 50. I'm not young anymore.
Well, you're younger than me, but there's, I mean, wargaming is to a degree, dominated by female gamers and particularly painters. I mean, I look at some of the channels that are presented by female figure painters, and they are just incredible kind of artists in what they do. So it's quite a broad church, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, traditionally it was relatively a male orientated hobby. But with things like Games Workshop and I think also just the explosion in stuff like Dungeons and Dragons and that kind of stuff as well, or the re-explosion of it in the last few years has really kind of opened the doors to more women into the hobby. And you go to Salute or something, there's a real mix in demographics down there, and I think it's brilliant. I think the more people that are involved in it from every walk of life is fantastic, and I guess historical wargaming is still a little probably male orientated. It's more like the science fiction and the fantasy stuff that is a bit more mixed. But we are, we're still getting. There's quite a lot of women in historical wargaming as well. I mean, one of the standouts is probably Annie from Bad Squiddo Games, which I know you're aware of, and she basically makes 28mm figures of women from history. So that covers everything. So, talking like, female Viking warriors and what else we have? Female snipers. And also, she does she does specific personalities as well.
She did a range on the SOE recently, I think, didn't you? And Resistance.
Exactly, yeah.
Amazing
right, yeah,
figures, absolutely amazing work.
Yeah, they're beautiful. The sculpts on them are fantastic. They're really nice. The only problem is I don't play games in 28mm, otherwise I'd have loads of them. I do a smaller scale, but yes, I mean, there's space for all these people, and for Annie to have an incredibly successful career out of it, and that is her career. That's all she does is sell female toy soldiers to people.
Amazing. It's just brilliant, really brilliant. So, I mean, a bit like, I'm often recommending books to the listeners of this podcast and sending them off to spend far too much of their money. And wargaming can be very much like that, can't it? It's a massive rabbit hole. I don't know about that, but it's a massive rabbit hole, though, isn't it, wargaming? But a good place to start, I would say, is your channel, Storm of Steel.
Oh, well, thank you. I mean, as I say, I mean, the things that I'm mainly interested in is Second World War, First World War, and the Napoleonic Wars. So I cover those mostly in the channel, with bits and pieces, other bits and pieces like Vietnam War and things. But yes, I also try to do like painting tutorials and things, and some bits and pieces of history as well, and also just I try to make some videos on how to play games, specific sets of rules, and just because there are some rules you might read them first time round and just not really understand how they work. So I try to, some people learn through watching and listening rather than reading. So I try to do that as well with rules. I do rules reviews, so I can talk about, what I like about sets of rules and things. So I cover quite a lot of stuff on the channel as much as possible, really, just around. And also, I've just put a video out, and it was of the Hammerhead War Games show. So I basically went around all the tables and filmed them, and I got a couple of interviews with people and things. And I did that at Salute as well, so you can kind of have an idea as to what is going on at these conventions, and people who live in Australia who can't get to them very readily get to see them as well.
And there's a lot of those conventions, isn't there, right across the country?
Oh, there is. There's a lot. Yeah, there's almost, I think, at least one every month, if not every few weeks. So it is said that they start early February, I think, is the earliest one in up here, at least at Vapnatak in York, and then you have the one that's just gone, which is Hammerhead. There's Partisan, which is my favourite, which has some of the best tables on it, the best eye candy. There's also the other Partisan, which is in October later in the year. Then you've got Salute in the middle of the year, April time. You've got tons of other ones again, all the way up from from Cornwall all the way up to the top of Scotland. You can go to conventions almost every week, really.
And if someone wants to get an idea, they can go along. And wargamers are pretty friendly people, aren't they? If you had no idea what this is about, and you're interested in history, and you want to see history expressed in a different way, a kind of show is quite a good place to start.
I'd say so, yeah. It can feel a little overwhelming, but it is worth going to just because there's so much going on, and they are very crowded. Because us wargamers, we like a good bargain, so we always turn up for the bring and buy at these things. They're always crowded, but yeah, I mean they're worth just popping in, and most of them probably cost somewhere about £5 entry fee, and that just goes straight back into the show to help them run it again the following year, and. And I think, to be honest, ever since I've been going to wargaming shows since the 80s, I think they've never changed their prices. They've always been about £5. So I don't know how they're doing that. But yeah, I mean, that's the way to do it. And then, if there's anything, because you have the games on display, a lot of them are what's called participation games. So you could actually sit down and play for half an hour just to have a quick game or something. The one at Hammerhead, I think everything was a participation game. So you could have just gone there and spent all day just playing game after game after game. And on top of that, you also have all the traders. So people selling the figures, selling the paints, selling the brushes, selling the vehicles, and also selling the rules as well. And as you said, Paul, I mean, the very friendly, welcoming, inviting bush. I mean, it's always good to get new people involved in wargaming from every age, from teenagers up. Really, everybody is welcome, and you'd be almost urged to sit down and play a game if you're walking past the table. They want people to play the games that they put on. So don't be fearful of it.
No, and the visual side of it, I think, is something who's never seen anyone. If somebody listening to this who's never seen a game like this, go along and just to see the kind of visual spectacle, really, of some of these games, because they are absolutely stunning to see how people have recreated some of these battlefields. It's really, truly amazing.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much research that goes into them just to get, like you say, the look of the battlefield right, even the lay of the land is correct, all these kind of things, just the details that you see on these tabletops, and it's absolutely mind blowing. I've been a wargamer since I was, I don't know, 12, 13 years old, and I'm still blown away by the amount of work and detail that people put into their boards just to show them off for a day, in a big old ex hangar down in Newark. It's amazing. Like,
brilliant. That's brilliant. Well, we'll put links to your channel, of course, and there's a video where you're talking about wargaming the First World War, which I'll embed onto the web page for this episode, so people can find you that way too. But I mean, thanks for this chat, Alex. It's absolutely kind of amazing to talk about two really important kind of elements of the layers of First World War history, as we've said, from the battlefield to the tabletop, and kind of the things that join them together, really.
Oh, well, again, I'm honoured to be on this podcast. It's on my podcast list, and I do love listening to it. So it's nice to be invited on, and yeah, I'm happy to talk about. I could talk the legs off a donkey if you wanted to about battlefield archaeology or about wargaming. Really, well, I don't know how much you've got to space you've got to save on your computer, but
well, who knows? One of these days we might end up doing some kind of old frontline convention ourselves and bringing wargaming into that as much as the history, because we have ways to do it now. I mean, Nick from Two Fat Lardies goes there every year and sets up a fantastic demo game for World War II. So, about time we maybe did something like that for the First World War. So,
brilliant.
Who knows? But thank you, mate. I'd say we'll put all those links to you, and thanks for joining us on this. And I'm sure this won't be the last time that we talk. And let's hope we've pushed a few people across that line who might think about doing a bit of wargaming or modelling as a result of this podcast.
That's a victory in and of itself, I think.
Yeah. Thanks, Alex. Cheers, mate.
No worries. Thank you, Paul.
You've been listening to an episode of The Old Front Line with me, military historian Paul Reed. You can follow me on Twitter at Somcor. You can follow the podcast at Old Frontline Pod. Check out the website at oldfrontline.co.uk, where you'll find lots of podcast extras and photographs and links to books that are mentioned in the podcast. And if you feel like supporting us, you can go to our Patreon page, patreon.com/oldfrontline, or support us on Buy Me a Coffee at buymeacoffee.com/oldfrontline. Links to all of these are on our website. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you again soon.